Davis, and I'm the president of Next Gen America, the country's largest youth vote organization in the country. That last election helped mobilize 1 in 9 young voters, leading to the largest youth voter turnout in American history. And we know the transformative power that young people can have as the largest, the most progressive, and the most diverse generational voting bloc. And despite what MAGA Republicans say, what's best about our country, this country, is our diversity. And I know this too because I live this. My mom is the oldest of 9 kids from a poor farm-working family in southern Mexico. And my dad's a white American hippie that met her there while he was living on a commune. And my white grandpa even used to say that me and my siblings were purebred Irish Mexican Americans. And as a kid, I knew there was nothing purebred about my background, but I got to see and learn something that a lot of other people don't. That it doesn't matter where you come from, the color of your skin, who you love, or how you pray. That at the end of the day, we all just want the same things. That we want to be safe, we want to be healthy, we want to go to great schools, we want to be respected for who we are, and we want to have good jobs and then time off from those jobs to be with those that we love and to do what we love. And when Bernie Sanders ran for president in 2016, he taught our entire country that wanting those basic things wasn't asking for too much. That in fact, those basic things were something that every single family and person in the richest country in the world could and should have. But some MAGA Republicans seem to only believe in the power of the ultra-wealthy and the well-connected. But we believe in the power of us. And we know it's not asking too much to not only judge our economy by how well big corporations are doing, but to judge our economy by how well ordinary people are doing. And we know it isn't asking too much that every single American be able to go to the doctor when they are sick and have the highest quality health care when they need it. And we sure as hell know it's not asking too much to leave it up to women to decide when they are ready to make a family instead of politicians. And we know it isn't asking too much to transition our economy off of dirty fossil fuels that are literally killing us. To clean energy that will create millions of good jobs and leave a healthy planet for every single future generation. And that is why young people are turning out in record numbers, because we know our country is at a fork in the road. In one side, one way veers towards fascism and authoritarian rule. And the other, to where the people rule. That's why at Next Gen, we don't put our hope in any single one politician or party. We put our hope in y'all, in America's young people. Because every time our country has made a great leap forward, it took the courage, the imagination, and impatience of young people to make it so. And we turned out in record numbers in 2020, not just to defeat Donald Trump. We turned out not just to fight against something, but for something. For a vision of our country that was more just, more fair, more inclusive, for a government that would truly represent us. So, record-breaking youth voter turnout doesn't just send Donald Trump packing, it also gets us historic gun safety legislation when politicians said it couldn't be done. It gets us the largest investment by any country on the entire planet to tackle the climate crisis. It gets us student debt cancellation. And it gets us long overdue reform on marijuana. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm pretty sure we're going to keep organizing and voting until we legalize that everywhere, am I right? That is the power of the youth agenda and voting power in action. And I know we're not finished, that we're just getting started, and that we have a lot more we want to get done, and that's why every single one of us is going to vote and get out every person we know and love to vote this election. And we have to remember the power of our numbers, because the other side wants us to be cynical, to believe that voting doesn't matter, yet in state after state, they are trying to make it harder for us to vote because they know how damn powerful our vote is. You know, earlier it was said that the arc of history bends towards justice, and it does. But we have to be the ones to bend it. And with the full weight and power of 70 million young eligible voters across the country, we can do it. Now, I want to tell you a story about where I come from. I come from the state of Texas. Usually I get booed for that, so thank you. But I come from Texas, and last legislative session, they were proposing more bills to make it harder to vote in my state. In fact, it is the state that is designated by the Brennan Center as the hardest place to vote in America. And a lot of people, when they think of Texas, they think of people like my white grandpa. He always wore a nice, fine pair of cowboy boots and a cowboy hat. And we got a lot of great white cowboys in Texas. But our state is actually majority young, brown, and black. And so we're going to talk about those numbers and power. So last legislative session, when they wanted to propose this bill, we decided we wanted to show the millions of young people across our state our power. Well, Beto O'Rourke, when he ran against Ted Cruz in 2018, he lost by about 220,000 votes. Well, do you know how many young people of color turn 18 every year in Texas? 270,000. So, while these legislators were debating this bill that they knew they were going to pass anyway to make it harder for us to vote, we snuck in 30 young activists and organizers into our Texas Capitol, filled with backpacks, filled to the top with 270,000 different colored rose petals. And we climbed the Texas Rotunda and all took position, and we waited for the sign of when we were going to throw the roses because, of course, we didn't ask permission to do that. And it happened when a 19-year-old singer dressed in a pink power suit, and she had flowers all in her hair. She went and stood in the middle of the Texas Star, and she looked straight up at us, and she started to sing as loudly and as powerfully as she could, Amazing Grace. And as she sang that, we dropped all of those roses all around her. And it was beautiful. It was powerful. And in that moment, we could feel the history of those that came before us and fought for our right to vote and died, and those that came after us. And I cried because I could feel in that moment all of that weight. And that day, we sent a message to millions of young people across our state and to those legislators that we had the numbers and power to win, and ultimately we would. And that along the way, we would fight their darkness with our light. We would fight against their ugliness with our beauty. And if you try and cut a rose bush down, it'll grow back. So let's send a message to every single politician in this state and across our country that is trying to take us backwards, that if they want to cling to the past, they can have it. But the future, that's going to belong to all of us. So I want to recognize our next speaker and co-host, but before I do, I have to recognize my dad's here. He drove all the way from Columbus, Ohio. Poppy, can you please stand? My lefty hippie father that voted every single time for Bernie Sanders, thank you. So I want to recognize our next speaker, an incredible powerhouse leading one of the most incredible organizations across the country, our co-host from MoveOn, Rana Epstein. You give it up for her, y'all.
Hello, Ann Arbor. I am thrilled to be here. You know, I've never been here before. It's a pretty amazing city. Don't be disappointed. I'm happy to be here now. But I come with me bringing love and solidarity from millions, seriously, millions of MoveOn members all across this country that are gathering in rooms just like this to do the work to ensure that we advance this country forward and we defeat MAGA Republicans on Tuesday. So we are not alone, folks. We are millions strong, and we have 3 days. 3 days till the voters decide the fate of this country. 3 days till we, all of us, decide the fate of this country. 3 days to talk to voters, to talk to our friends and family, to make sure they have a plan to vote, to ensure they cast their ballots, and ensure that they do the same and talk to everyone they can. 3 days till we determine whether we're going to continue to go forward or whether we're going to go backwards. Do we want to go backwards? No. Do we want a national abortion ban? No. Do we want to elect leaders that want to give tax breaks to the wealthy at the expense of the rest of us? No. Do we want people in office? Do we want people in office that are willing and actually excited to go against the will of the voters and undermine our democracy? No, hell no. We are not going backwards. We have made so much progress over generations. We've expanded the franchise of democracy to people of color, to women, to all of us. It is ours to keep. It is ours to fight for. We are not going backwards. In just these 2 years, when we elected President Biden, we called on him to cancel student debt, and he delivered. And we have so much more to do. We elected the U.S. House and Senate, and we told them climate change is serious and you need to get to work. And they passed the largest climate bill in U.S. history. And we have more work to do. And as Christina said, we decriminalized marijuana. But we have more work to do, folks. We're not done. We are winning, but we are making progress, but we need more time. We have to ensure that this economy works for all of us, not just Elon Musk. We need to increase the minimum wage. We need to make sure every worker has a right to a voice on the job. We need to codify our abortion rights. We need to protect and respect our right to vote, and so much more. We are not stopping. Are we stopping? Hell no! And the one very essential ingredient we need to continue to move forward is we need people in office that believe and will protect and safeguard democracy, that believe that our votes should be listened to and they matter. And that is quite literally what's at stake on Tuesday. We have over 2/3 of Republican candidates are on the record as election deniers. Okay, so we have work to do. But I believe in us. You know, I am a daughter of an Iranian immigrant woman and an African-American man from Mississippi, descendant from slaves. And a very core principle they taught me growing up is to embrace an undying faith in the belief of the American dream and the promise of the American dream, and that we can have a country, we can have a democracy, we can have an economy that really is set up for all of us to thrive, where we can take care of one another. This is possible. We just have to manifest it. We just have to make it happen. And I have good news. We can. We can. Because there are more of us than them, folks. We are the majority. And when we show up, we win. What happens when we show up? What happens when we show up? Louder. What happens when we show up? That's right. And speaking of showing up, have I got a guy for you? A man who always shows up for the people. He always shows up for democracy. He shows up for climate justice. He shows up for an economy that works for all of us. Our friend Sanders.
Thank you, Ann Arbor. And thank you, Rana, for the introduction. Let me thank MoveOn and NextGen for helping to sponsor this great event. And it's good to be back in Ann Arbor. This election coming up in a few days is, I think you know, is the most consequential midterm election in our lifetimes. And one of the problems that we have is that midterms are not necessarily sexy elections. You know, when somebody runs for president, everybody knows who the candidate is. They like this guy, they like that woman, whatever it may be. But midterms have to do with who controls the legislature, who controls Congress, who controls the Senate. Who cares? So I'm here to tell you that you should care, that it is of enormous consequence. So before I go any further, I did want to mention, I believe we have here your wonderful, wonderful U.S. Congresswoman, Debbie Dingell. And Rashida Tlaib from Detroit did not want me to introduce her. She is in disguise, trying to fit in as University of Michigan student, wearing a sweatshirt, but she is also a great member of the United States Congress. So what is this election about, and why is it so consequential? Well, let me just tick off the reasons. And what I'm going to tell you is, you know, what politicians often don't tell you, and that is the truth. And the truth is, these are tough times. And if occasionally you want to throw your shoe at the television, we understand it. If you get depressed, overwhelmed, you are not the only one in America, because these are tough times. The pandemic knocked the hell out of us. Mental stress is probably at an all-time high in this country. Wherever I go, all over the country, all over my own state of Vermont, people talk about, what are you doing about mental health? And it's always been a problem we have not adequately dealt with, but it is much worse now because of the pandemic. We have a situation where just a number of months ago, the geniuses on the United States Supreme Court, you know, and this decision overturning Roe v. Wade is so outrageous, it's almost hard to comprehend. We are not in the year 1922, 1822, 1722. In the year 2022, these people have determined that women are not intelligent enough to control their own bodies. And that is so insulting, and it's literally almost beyond comprehension that responsibility should be given over to state government to tell women what they may or may not do with their bodies. But I would only add to what you already know, that I am assuming that most of you know how babies are made. This is not, in my view, a women's issue. This is an issue for everyone, and I hope the men understand, stand with the women on this issue. So the issue of women's rights and abortion rights, very important part of what this campaign is about. And our hope is that we will be able to codify Roe v. Wade in Congress. if we have the votes to do it, which is what this campaign is about. This campaign is about climate change. And again, I don't have to tell you about it, because you know about it, you've read about it, and you've seen what happens with your own eyes. What I can tell you is those who know the most about it, the scientists who study the issue, are calling this an existential threat to our planet. This is not a Michigan issue, it's not a Vermont issue, it's not an American issue, it's not a Chinese issue. This is an issue that impacts the entire world. And what we are seeing now is over the last 8 years, these years have been the hottest on record. You're seeing more and more drought, which will not only impact farmers' ability to grow crops, but it will result in mass migrations all over the world, because local farmers will not be able to stay on the land, can't get drinking water, cause great global strife as mass migrations take place. We are seeing more extreme weather disturbances having devastating impacts upon communities in America and around the world, which will cost us hundreds of billions of dollars over a period of time to repair that damage. And here is what is really difficult about this issue. If it were an American issue, I would say, all right, we gotta do it, we can do it. It is not an American issue. It is a global issue, and it's gonna require the cooperation of every country on Earth. And given what's going on right now, that is not easy. But that is our task. And I want to congratulate, by the way, the younger generation that has led the entire world, not only here in the United States, but all over the world, in saying to the leaders of this world, hey, stand up, we want a planet for our kids that is habitable. And the challenge here is whether we take on the greed of the fossil fuel industry, who are more interested in their short-term profits than the future of this planet. And we have got to take them on, defeat them, and in the process, as we move to energy efficiency and sustainable energy, we can create millions of good-paying jobs. So this election is about women's rights, it's about climate, and I'll tell you what else it's about. And as I've said in the last few days, as I go around the country, I never thought that as a United States Senator, I really would ever have to say this. You know, historically, you know, politics is about, we argue about education and the budget and healthcare and all that stuff. This campaign, in a very significant way, is about the future of American democracy. It is about Trump and his right-wing allies undermining American democracy by peddling a big lie that he won the election. Now, I want you to think about what kind of political system we can have when you have candidates saying that the only way I can lose an election is if there is fraud. You got that? I can't lose. I have to win. It's in the cards. God determined it. And the only way I could possibly lose, if I lose, it's clearly fraudulent. That is a cowardly, wimpy response to political defeat. Way back when, 1988, I was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and I ran for U.S. Congress. We have one seat. We're not Michigan. We got one seat in Vermont, Congress. And I ran as hard as I could. I really knocked my brains out all over that state. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, it was a three-way race of an independent running against a Republican and a Democrat. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, they announced that, you know, I had lost the election by, I think, 3 percentage points. I didn't go around saying it's a fraud. They stole the election. You know, I called up my opponent, congratulated him, thought about why I lost, 2 years later came back and won in a landslide. All right? So we are now dealing, I just came from Wisconsin this morning. Guy there who's the U.S. Senator there, Ron Johnson, is saying, somebody asked him on CNN, will you accept the election results? Well, we'll see. All right. So my message to these cowards is, have the guts to understand that in democracy we have rules. And the rules is that the majority wins. And when you win, great. And when you lose, accept defeat. Don't undermine democracy. But I wish that I could tell you that our only problem with democracy was Trump and his right-wing extremist friends. That ain't the case. So I want to tell you as bluntly as I can what others may not tell you, and that is you are living in a corrupt political system in which every day billionaires are buying and selling politicians. When you turn on the TV and you see ads, understand that many of those ads are ads from super PACs paid for by a handful of billionaires. So if you're sitting on $10 billion, you could throw $100 million into an election. It's, chump change. You don't care. And that's what they're doing. Give you an example. I was in Los Angeles, last week, campaigning for a very nice woman who I hope is elected, named Karen Bass. And Karen is running against a guy. She's not running for president of the United States, running for mayor of Los Angeles. This guy is a multi-billionaire spending $100 million of his own money. Tomorrow, I'll be in Pittsburgh. Tonight, I'll be in Pittsburgh, but for an event tomorrow with a young woman named Summer Lee. And Summer is an excellent candidate, standing up for working people, for young people, for people of color. And in the last week, super PACs are spending over $1 million on TV ads and literature trying to defeat her. So you are living in a political moment where billionaires can say, all right, we're going to take out that candidate, write out your checks, we're going to spend millions and millions of dollars. And you don't even have to know who these guys are. Just billionaires who think they have the right to determine who wins and who loses elections. That is not what democracy is about. And that is why we must overturn Citizens United. And move to public funding of elections. Now, one of the things that makes me most proud is very often as I go around the country, people will come up to me and say, Bernie, you inspired me and you got me to run for school board or state legislature, whatever it is. And that moves me very much because I want all of you who have that bent, who have that interest, to think about running for public office, no matter what it is. But what I don't want you to have to do is to have to bow down and beg for campaign funds from wealthy people. That's not what democracy is about. And now I want to say a few words that is not talked about enough in terms of where we are as a nation. It's not talked about by Republicans, and it is not talked enough by Democrats. And that is the nature of our economy today, and what it is. So let's talk about it for a little bit. In my humble opinion, this nation is moving rapidly toward an oligarchic form of society. Do you all know what that means, oligarchy? When I was a kid, you study history and you study social studies, they use small countries in Latin America as oligarchies, countries where a handful of families control the economy, control the political life, they own the local newspaper, they own the television stations. It's called an oligarchy. Saudi Arabia is run by a multi-billion dollar, very cruel and anti-democratic family. And that's an example of what an oligarchy is. They control it all. So I want you to understand what's going on in America today. In terms of our economy, we now have more concentration of ownership than we have ever had in the history of this country. And for whatever reason, obviously having to do with money, neither Republican or Democratic administrations have had the guts to break up these monopolies. So where we are right now is in sector after sector of our economy, a handful of corporations control it. But this is even worse. I didn't even know this until recently. You think Comcast, the large corporation. Well, it's Comcast. It's not Comcast. Comcast is owned by somebody else, who's owned by somebody else. Turns out, check it out, that there are 3 Wall Street firms, BlackRock. Anybody here ever hear of BlackRock? Well, that's the most important firm that you never heard of. BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. These are the 3 major Wall Street firms that together control over $20 trillion in assets, which is the equivalent of the GDP of the United States of America. So if you go, and it's an interesting exercise, go to a company that a General Motors, whatever it may be, and find out, these are not mom and pop operations. They're not owned by some guy, some woman. They're owned by large entities who are owned by other entities. And you find out that these 3 major Wall Street firms are the leading stockholders in hundreds and hundreds of corporations throughout this country. They will determine whether jobs stay in the United States, whether they go to China or Mexico. They will determine whether the workers get treated with respect, have decent wages and benefits. Unbelievable power in the hands of a handful of multi-billionaires. During the last year and a half, I've been involved in a number of strikes all over this country, just standing up with workers and doing what we can. And what we found is we thought we were taking on a company. Turns out the company is owned by somebody else, and often owned by somebody else. And in almost every instance, what you had are billionaires owning corporations that were making huge profits and squeezing workers harder and harder, trying to take away their health care benefits or their vacation time or whatever it may be. So that's what you got overall in the economy, an economy controlled by fewer and fewer people. And then you got the political system, which I mentioned a moment ago. That's oligarchy, billionaires buying and selling politicians. And you got the media, which determines and tells us what is important and what is not important. Now, Trump is not right. It's not fake news. Writers don't lie about what they cover. What is true is that when you are a media entity, and you're owned by billionaires, there are issues that you will gravitate to, and there are issues that you will not gravitate to. And whole swaths of American society, issues of great importance are simply not discussed. That's what Noam Chomsky, remember, any of you ever read Noam Chomsky? Called manufacturing consent. Manufacturing consent. And that's exactly what goes on. So you got 90% of media controlled by 6 huge media conglomerates owned by billionaires. What you also have in the economy right now, which we don't talk about, politicians don't talk about because they often get funded by these guys, and the media doesn't talk about it because they are owned by these guys. And I don't know how many of you even know this, but right now at this moment, we have more income and wealth inequality than we've ever had in the history of America. And I want you to, when we talk about outrage, part of what media does is they tell us what we're allowed to be outraged at. And often what they tell us to be outraged at, we should be. But they miss a whole lot. Today, 3 people in America, 3 multi-zillionaires, own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. I think that's outrageous. You got 165 million Americans over here. You got 3 guys over there. That is not what this country is supposed to be about. You have the top 1% owning more wealth than the bottom 92%. When I was a kid growing up, the gap between CEO, the bosses of a company, and workers were 20 to 1. Bosses always obviously made more money than workers. 20 to 1. And over the years, it grew and grew and grew. Today, it is the highest ratio in American history. CEOs make 400 times more than their average employee. So you have massive income and wealth inequality, and that gap is growing wider. Give you one example of how really disgusting it is. In the midst of this pandemic that we are still experiencing, tens and tens of thousands of workers went to work because they thought it important to go to work and because they had to go to work. They didn't have a choice. In a nation in which 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck, people did not have the choice about whether they stay home. They had to go to work. Tens of thousands of those workers, 5,000 or more nurses died doing their jobs in the pandemic. People working in warehouses died. Meatpacking house workers died. Public transportation workers died. Cops and firemen died doing their jobs. So people who kept the economy going died by the tens of thousands. And during that same period, the billionaire class saw a $2 trillion increase in their wealth. So what is going on in America is the rich are doing phenomenally rich, and what's going on for ordinary people? Let's talk about it. Let's think about it for a moment. You're an average working person. As I mentioned, 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. Do you all know what that means, paycheck to paycheck? And I grew up in a family that lived paycheck to paycheck. I grew up in a 3.5-room rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn. And what paycheck to paycheck means is that you live under massive anxiety every week, worrying about whether your car breaks down and you can't afford to get it fixed to get to work. You're worried whether your kid gets sick and you can't afford to take her to the doctor. You worry about what's happening to your mom if she falls and how you're going to pay that medical bill. You're worried about going to the grocery store and being able to afford the food you need or paying for the rent you need in order to keep your family sheltered. That's living paycheck to paycheck. And you know what the result of all of that anxiety for low-income and working-class people is? They die at a significantly younger age than wealthy people. We have a massive gap in this country in life expectancy. As a nation, we do pretty badly. But if you're rich, you're up there with other countries. If you are poor or working class, depending on where you live, you may die 10 or 15 years younger than wealthy people. Poverty and economic anxiety causes death. And millions of people throughout this country are dealing with that right now. So our job economically, and this is not an easy job, and I don't say it simply and rhetorically, and it's going to happen tomorrow. The future of this country, to a large degree, depends upon whether working people can stand united and take on the greed of the billionaire class and create an economy that works for all and not just a few. And here is the good news in a sense. Now, we're taking on enormously powerful people. Love you too. Thank you. We're taking on enormously powerful people with unlimited resources. Unlimited resources. More money than you can possibly dream of. 100 million means nothing. The good news is, at the end of the day, there are more of us than there are of them. And the good news also is that in a nation which in fact is divided on issues like guns or abortion or gay rights and all that stuff, on economic issues, believe it or not, there is a lot more coming together in agreement than the media will tell you. Let me give you an example. Overwhelmingly, the American people, Democrat, Republican, Independent, understand that if you work 40 hours a week, you should not live in poverty, that we've got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And that living wage is at least $15 an hour. And I'll tell you some other good news. The other good news is that workers all across this country understand that when you're alone on the job, you have no power at all. And people all across this country, blue collar, white collar, service industry, are working to form unions. And in my view, we will not rebuild the middle class until we rebuild the trade union movement. We've got to make it easier for workers to organize, not harder. The American people understand, what everybody in this room knows, is that we have today a healthcare system which is broken, which is dysfunctional, which is cruel. The function of our healthcare system is not to provide quality care to all people in a cost-effective way. The function of the system today is to make tens of billions in profit for the insurance companies and the drug companies, which is why we must move toward a Medicare for all single-payer program. Let me, as the chairman of the Senate Health Committee, let me just tell you for a moment how cruel and broken and disgusting this system is. For a start, not widely known because the TV doesn't talk about it too much, media doesn't talk about it, we are spending twice as much per person on health care as the people of any other nation. Do you know that? So you look at Canada, you look at UK, you look at Europe, we are spending over $12,000 for every man, woman, and child. Can you imagine? $48,000 for a family of 4. And with all of that expenditure, twice as much as other countries, we have 85 million Americans who are uninsured or underinsured. You got 1 out of 4 Americans who cannot afford the prescription drugs their doctors write because the prices are so astronomically high. And what they don't tell you also is when you got so many people who can't afford health insurance, they can't afford the deductible, the copayment, in a given year, 60,000 Americans die unnecessarily because they don't get to a doctor on time. And meanwhile, the drug companies and the insurance companies roll in profits. In my view, and in the view of the vast majority of the American people, healthcare is a human right, not a privilege. I'll tell you 2 stories here. During my presidential campaign, I left from Detroit, went to Ontario, Canada, with people who were diabetic. And you know why we went? We went to a drugstore in Ontario to buy insulin products. And you know what? We found out, we knew it before we left, of course, was that the price for the same exact product in Ontario, Canada, was 1/10 the price it was in Michigan. And there were people there, I mean, there was a mother with a kid. She was crying. I mean, here she was struggling to provide insulin for her kids. She was buying it in Canada for 10% of the price. I live in Burlington, Vermont, 50 miles away from the Canadian border. And in Canada, if you, say, have a serious medical problem, a heart surgery, a transplant, or whatever it is, and you're in the hospital there for 3 or 4 weeks, do you know what the bill is when you leave? Zero. And that is true in nations all over the world, zero or almost. Talk to the Finnish ambassador. We had him up in Vermont. In Finland, at the end of the day, you can't spend more than $240 a year on health care. Okay? And this is what goes on around the world. And they manage to do that spending half as much as we do per capita. So this issue of health care as a human right is a major issue. And I know I'm going to be working with Rashida and Debbie to make sure that we finally do what every other major country on earth does, guarantee health care to all people. And when we talk about the future of America, we obviously have got to talk about education. And again, I'm asking you to think big, not small. I'm asking you to get away from the day-to-day stuff that we experience. Think about it for a moment. We live in an increasingly competitive global economy. We are seeing radical changes in technology every day. And God knows what artificial intelligence and robotics will mean to our economy and to workers' jobs in coming years. But what we do know is because of this explosion in technology and the competitiveness of the global economy, we need to have the best educated workforce in the world. We need to make sure that all of our kids who have the desire and the ability are able to get a higher education, able to go to the tech schools that will train them to do the important work that needs to be done. We have spent $300 billion, by the way, just a few months ago in Congress, investing in energy efficiency and sustainable energy. And we are going to need workers to help us deal with that transformation, help us rebuild our infrastructure. We need more doctors. We need more nurses. We need more teachers. We need more dentists. We need more social workers. We need more psychologists. But we're not going to fill those gaps, which exist right now. Major teacher shortage, doctor shortage, nursing shortage, dentist shortage. We're not going to fill those gaps unless we have a revolution in higher education. Now, 100 years ago, some really brave people said, you know what? Education should be available not just to rich kids, but to working class kids as well. And they created public education in America. Big deal. And what they said is that every kid in America, regardless of income, should be able to go to a free school, public school, from K through 12. And that was a great and important step forward for America. But the world has changed. And our demand must be that we have free public colleges and universities right now. I was in Pittsburgh a couple of months ago talking to some nurses. And the nurses there were telling me they graduated nursing school tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And it was holding them back in terms of they married, having kids, buying the cars they wanted, and so forth and so on. If you were to go to medical school, anybody here going to medical school or thinking about going to medical school? All right, we got a few. It is not uncommon for people to be graduating medical school $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in debt. How insane is that? So for the future, not only of individuals, but for the future of our economy, we have got to make public colleges and universities tuition free. And by the way, we've got to cancel all student debt in this country. Now, let me conclude by talking about the issue of inflation. I mentioned earlier, inflation in America is 8.2%. That's high. My Republican colleagues blame Joe Biden and me for inflation in America. Not quite the case. As I think all of you know, inflation is higher in many European countries around the world. It's a global problem caused by the breakdown of supply chains and the pandemic and the war in the Ukraine. That's the major reason. But there's another reason out there. What's the third reason? Corporate greed. All right? So I hope that everybody in Michigan understands that when you have to pay $4 to fill up a gallon to fill up their gas tank, that ExxonMobil and Chevron and ConocoPhillips are enjoying record-breaking profits. So when elderly people have to worry about whether they can afford a pound of hamburger, understand that the food industry is enjoying record-breaking profits. Pharmaceutical industry is enjoying record-breaking profits. Now, in terms of inflation, after blaming Biden and me and others for the problem, what Republicans say, they don't get too specific for a reason. They say it's all that federal spending. That's causing inflation. Well, when they really mean, what they won't tell you, is they're talking about the American Rescue Plan. So let me tell you, as the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, about the American Rescue Plan. I want you all, in America, we all have short memory spans for whatever reason. But we do. But I want you to think back to March of 2021 when the American Rescue Plan was passed. At that moment, we were suffering the worst public health crisis, the pandemic, COVID pandemic, that the country has experienced in 100 years since the Spanish flu. 3,000 people were dying every single day. The doctors and nurses in hospital did not even have the personal protective equipment they needed. They were dying. Hospitals were being overwhelmed with COVID patients, not knowing even how to treat them effectively. Worst public health crisis in the modern history of America. Simultaneously, because of the pandemic, we were suffering the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Millions and millions and millions of people were losing their jobs. Small businesses, as you will recall, were going bankrupt. Hunger was higher than it had ever been in decades, and millions of people who no longer had an income were worried about getting evicted from their homes or their apartments. That was the reality. And as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee that helped write that bill, I will not apologize to anybody that we produced a bill which provided $1,400 for every man, woman, and child in this country at a time of need. No apologies that we increased the child tax credit $300 per month per child. No apologies that we extended unemployment and raised unemployment benefits. No apologies that we put billions of dollars into hospitals and schools to keep them afloat. That's what a government in a democratic, civilized society does. When people are living in fear and desperation, you stand up and come to their aid. Now, that was an expensive bill. A lot of money, $1.9 trillion. Republicans right now also have an idea, And their idea is to provide the top 1/10 of 1% a massive tax break by repealing the estate tax for $1.5 trillion addition to our national debt. We spent 1.9 saving the working class of this country, and they want to spend 1.5 trillion giving massive breaks to Elon Musk's family and the other billionaire families. So that is what this campaign is about. It's a moment in history where the differences, the ideologies of the two parties are different. I'm not here to tell you, not for a second, that I think the Democratic Party is doing anywhere near what it should be doing. But at this particular moment in history, the choice is clear. And it is absolutely imperative that up and down the line, we defeat right-wing Republicans, we elect Democrats. But this is not over on Election Day, no matter what the results are. The future of this country rests with you guys. Whether or not you'll be able to raise your kids in a healthy world is determined by what you're going to do. Whether you live in a democracy, whether you're going to go out and get jobs that pay you good salaries, whether you have decent housing, all of that is dependent upon what you do. Now, what the establishment ends up telling us in one way or another is that ordinary people, they don't say it, but that's really what they mean. You have no power. You're helpless. You can't do anything. They got all the power. They got all the money. Well, they do have a lot of money. They do have a lot of power. But if we stand together and not let Trump and his right-wing friends divide us up by the color of our skin or where we were born or our sexual orientation or our religion, if we stand together around an agenda that makes sense for the ordinary American, there is nothing that we cannot do. So I want to conclude by saying what I have said, and it's true. Country faces enormous problems, but I don't want you to think that the situation is hopeless. It is absolutely not hopeless. We can transform this reality if we have the vision and fight for a vision of a government and an economy that works for all, not the few. We can do it. We're strong enough, we're smart enough, we have the energy to do it. Let's go out and do it. Thank you all very much.